as well as the materials that we're using today. As I just mentioned, if you have questions, please do raise your hand. We're hoping for it to be very interactive, so there'll be the chat function and other interactive elements. But I will now hand over to Maya and Sean to tell us more about how this is going to work. Hang on a second, I need to unmute Maya. Maya, are you able to mute everybody?
Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. So thank you, Mim, for the introduction. That has perfectly introduced us into our team for today. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Supply Chain for SMEs. Thank you all for taking time to be with us today. For the next 2 hours, we'll explore the link between supply chains and climate change and how that impacts businesses, specifically in small and medium-sized environment. So let me first share my screen with you. Yeah, just a moment. There we go. So right into the introductions. I am your host for today. My name is Maya. I'm a consultant in climate and carbon team at Temple Group. That's part of the business that supports organizations to address the climate emergency through strategic and technical support. I provide support in development of net zero plans with a particular focus on organizational carbon footprinting in development of sector-specific carbon reduction plans. I'm supported by my colleague Shangyu today, and even though you won't hear from her, she will help me answer your questions in the end of the session. Sean is a director in our team with multiple years of experience supporting public and private sector bodies to develop carbon reduction plan and facilitate transition to low carbon economy. So a little bit about Temple. Temple is an environmental consultancy with offices in multiple locations around the UK. And our mission is to accelerate sustainable action, positive change for our clients, community, and the planet. And that's what our teams of environmental and sustainability specialists work tirelessly towards. So this also aligns with our commitment as a B Corp of being purpose-driven business and driving the change we want to see in the world. So as a company, we specialize in planning and development of complex infrastructural and social programs. And our team in particular had a privilege of working with many great companies on their journey to net zero, and we've helped them develop their approach to climate action. So this all wouldn't be possible, and we wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for Better Bankside. That's the organization that's coordinating this scheme, as you all know. They have recognized Temple's commitment to positive change and has chosen us as their technical partner for delivery of the Southwark Climate Collective program. So this program is designed to support SMEs across the borough in acting on climate. There are 4 program streams to which participant businesses take part. That's waste, energy, freight, supply chain. And Temple is providing training in 3 of these, which are waste, energy, and supply chain. And this last one we're going to delve deeper in here today. So basically, this program is set up for SMEs to improve your sustainability, in particular carbon footprint, and to help you with developing knowledge, technical skills to enable you to deal with your suppliers better. The reason why we're running this program is to enable you also to be prepared to any more strict regulations coming your way in the future, to respond to expectation from your customers, workforce in terms of carbon footprint disclosure. but also to help UK achieve their net zero goals. As you all know, UK has a legally binding target of achieving net zero by 2050, and we're all going to be expected to deliver and contribute to that. So studies have shown that major obstacles to SME climate disclosure is in fact the lack of knowledge. So the purpose of this program is to help you recognize what your carbon emissions are, how to measure them, and how to disclose them, so that it helps you become more competitive and improve your positioning in the global supply chain. So today's session is the first in the series of 3, and the next webinars we have coming up are on supply chain management in May, and followed by due diligence in procurement. So if you find this training useful and you're interested in any of these areas, please check out Southwark Climate Collective webpage and sign up for them, and do come along and join us for another webinar. So just before we get started, a couple of house rules. I believe that your microphones are already muted, so unfortunately there's no possibility of checking in. But if you want to ask questions, you can do that through the Teams chat box, and we'll be happy to respond to them in the end of the session during the Q&A part. We'll also be running a few polls throughout the session, so we really hope that you will take opportunity to participate in them, and that will go a long way in terms of customizing this session for you. Before we get into the main body of the presentation, it's time for a Menti. This is where I'd like you to participate in a poll. And I prepared 2 questions for you. Let's start off with the first one, but first you're going to have to join the voting app with your phone or a computer. We do encourage you to use your phone. So if you could go over to menti.com, and you should be able to see a code on this page. This is the one that's shown here on the screen, and 4898083. And the first questions I have for you is, from which industry sector do you come from? And I will just switch to Menti as well. There we go. Oh, the answers are already coming in. Lovely. Perfect. I'm just going to give you a couple of seconds to have everyone type in. Non-profit organization, terrific. Architecture as well. We have people from construction industry. It's quite relevant for what we have to say today. Perfect. So we've got quite a range here. These are all very, very relevant for what we're talking about today. Just keep them coming. So I would like to be very much for you to be represented in these sessions. I'll be using a lot of examples throughout the session, and I would like to be able to adapt them to your industry so that you can recognize the challenges that exist within and understand how to prioritize your emission reduction. Okay, that's terrific. So I have now another question for you, and let me just switch to it. There we go. Just one moment. Bear with me till I bring it up. And the following question is, why did you sign up for this session? So what's the reason that you decided you wanted to be here with us today? What would you like to learn? What would you like to find out? Improve supply chain, definitely. Decarbonize, yeah. This is what we're here for. Decarbonize. We're going to learn more about it because, yeah, many of you might be at the start of this journey, so you will need to know where to start from. Help measure emissions. Perfect. We will be talking about that in more detail. Lovely. So thank you all for sharing your answers to this question. I'm just going to jump in to the presentation now. Here we go. So there are a couple of things that we thought would be relevant for you. One of the first things we want to do is just to set a scene by explaining why we need to talk about supply chain and in the context of climate change. So then we'll provide a bit of a background about the key drivers and benefits of measuring supply chain emissions. And you will notice that I will start off a bit high level, and then I will provide more detail as the session progresses, and the second part of the session will be much more practical. So this is when I'll provide you with a step-by-step guidance on how to measure your supply chain emissions. And if you're already on that journey, this will help you move along the process into the next step. So we'll conclude with the Scope 3 exercises and Q&A part of the session. So the aim of this course is just to provide you with a bit of an understanding of the connection between supply chains and climate change, as well as of supply chain emission measurement, so that by the end of the course, you would be able to autonomously measure your own supply chain impact and understand associated challenges. So right on. I believe we can start with the presentation. So to start off, why we're actually holding these sessions, there's been so much talk about sustainability lately. I'm sure you would have noticed. But a couple of years ago, and if you recall, there wasn't much mention. It simply wasn't a thing. So you must be asking yourself, what did suddenly change? What happened in the society? So what happened is that we had this urgent realization that if we continue to explore our natural resources at the level at which we're doing now, the planet simply won't be able to sustain our current way of living. I'm just going to put it in the context. We're witnessing today a rapid increase in human population, which, by the way, will be hitting a record 9 billion in 2037, followed by economic expansion, urbanization, and energy consumption. And all these socioeconomic trends are straining our resources and causing significant environmental damage globally. We've been seeing destruction of ozone layer, increase in temperatures, widespread ocean acidification. And most importantly for us today, increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. So most of you are more familiar with this curve, which is most commonly used when talking about global warming. And this shows the increase of greenhouse gas emissions from the start of the Industrial Revolution, which has been identified as the main cause of climate change, with the last 40 years registering highest anthropogenic emissions in the recorded human history. So what this shows us that the body of scientific work has been here for years, if not decades, but we still haven't acted on it. And there's a quote by Bill Nye, American scientific communicator, who said, and I thought this was quite appropriate for today, he said, it's not that the world hasn't had more carbon dioxide. It's not that the world hasn't been warmer. The problem is the speed at which things are changing. We're inducing a 6-month extinction event kind of by accident, and we don't want to be the extinctee. And that's precisely what it is about. When the speed of the climate change became such that governments around the world could no longer ignore it, they realized that if we continue burning fossil fuels the way we do now, the planet simply won't be able to sustain our current activity, and this would have catastrophic consequences for the natural environment and our way of life. So I won't delve into details of the statistics here. I just wanted to show you what would happen if we didn't act on climate change, if no climate policies were put into action, how much we would witness in terms of climate warning based on that. And that would be a significant increase of up to 5 degrees, if not more, and would create hostile conditions in many places around the world. Then what would happen if we acted moderately, or if we acted in a little more proactive way? How much would be able to limit the climate warming based on that? So perhaps that would be below 2 degrees. Preferably it would be below 2 degrees Celsius. And more ambitious targets have been set below 1.5 degrees. Unfortunately, this is no longer attainable because we've reached the 1.5 degree warming limit this year. But what is crucial to understand here is that while the end year for projection here has been set at 2100, which may seem distant for many people, it's actually not that far away, especially if we consider the impact on the future generations. If you have small children like I do, they will be reaching their old age at that point, and they simply don't deserve to live in such a hostile climatic conditions. That's why we need to be more aggressive in our action and reduce significantly emissions to achieve net zero goals. So essentially, this is why the world has acknowledged the pressing need to tackle greenhouse gas emissions and has committed to taking action now in this moment, and governments have begun working together. So as a consequence, they produced many protocols, many agreements that are currently being undertaken in the area of climate change. One such important development was around 2015 Paris Agreement in a conference which was called COP25, with COP29 coming up soon, where countries committed to making pledges which would be progressively enhanced to meet the goals outlined in the Paris Agreement and keep the global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. So there has been a significant acceleration in the net zero pledge announced by governments, and many of those have actually begun to be enshrined in law. But the progress has in application of the policies hasn't been advanced as we would hope for. So hopefully we'll hear more in November with the next call coming up in Baku if there has been more progress in this area. Although the governments have taken the stand on this, it still falls on businesses to contribute to lower their emissions. Within the UK, it is estimated that business activities account for about half of all emissions, with SMEs contributing 47% to these emissions. So that's a quite significant contribution, which means that SMEs actually have a vital part to play in the effort to limit global warming to 2 degrees. And today, over 800 companies have committed to science-based targets. Only 80% of these are SMEs, and more participation is definitely needed from SMEs. For those who are unfamiliar with science-based targets, so these are the targets that companies around the world are setting, an increasing number of SMEs. And they will eventually come down to affect each single company in the world, independent of your market which you're servicing or the location where you're based. So at the time being, you probably don't feel obliged to set up a target because you're possibly operating only in the UK market, or you don't service any bigger company. But this will definitely change, and it's a matter of time before that happens. So it's best to be prepared for it. So for those of you who are setting on this journey, the Carbon Trust has published a Net Zero Roadmap for SMEs guidance, which can be followed to facilitate journey to decarbonization. It's a useful guidance which offers a lot of options and tips for reducing emissions, so I suggest you to have a look at it. But achieving net zero goals requires companies to identify their most significant emission reduction leverages, including those found throughout their supply chain. So this is a diagram that probably a lot of you recognize. It is from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Guidance document. And what that really shows is that greenhouse gas emissions are split in 3 scopes. So scope 1 are your direct emissions from owned or controlled sources, like, for instance, facilities, vehicles. They're most commonly fuels that you combust, or refrigerant gases, or other things that you release from your process. Scope 2 accounts for indirect emissions, typically coming from purchased cooling or heating, and then there are all the upstream and downstream activities which would fall under Scope 3. So, and this is where it gets more complex. So any product that you buy in order to produce your products comes with its own carbon footprint, represented in the upstream emissions. And then also, if you sell your product down to a market again, there might be some transport emissions which represent your downstream emissions. So scope 3 are generally the largest constituent of organizations' emissions. It can form up to 90% of the overall footprint, and that makes them the key part of managing climate risk, but are also the most difficult to quantify because of challenges related to data availability, accuracy, and understanding of methodology, etc. So I'm just going to show you the greenhouse gas protocol is split splits Scope 3 in 15 categories in total. So key component of Scope 3 emissions are emissions which make part of the supply chain. And these include both upstream and downstream activities, as we said, involved in production of the raw material, production of the product, delivery to the customer, and disposal of the product sold by the company. So if we look at more closely to these categories upstream, these are all emissions associated with the purchased goods, which will be different from company to company. So for instance, if you are a coffee shop, you might be purchasing coffee, milk, sugar. Construction company will purchase cement, steel, aluminium. So each of these products, like I mentioned, comes with their own carbon footprint, which will be accounted for in this category. So the capital goods or equipment that you purchase is accounted in the following category. For instance, construction companies, they purchase a lot of equipment for the work on site. So their emissions related to the purchase fuel and energy, that doesn't fall under Scope 1 or 2. So these are essentially emissions associated with production of the fuels that you use. And then we have upstream transportation. This is how the things get to your site. In case you are, for instance, food retailer, would be your inbound logistics. We'll have the waste generated from your operations, and then a couple of employee ones like business travel and employee commuting. And then one related to assets the company leases, which is upstream leased assets. This can be, for instance, leased car used for business travel, or leased heavy machinery used for construction process. And then downstream, we have categories which are quite similar in theme. Obviously, downstream transportation, distribution, if you're making products, that's how you get your product to your customer. There's processing of sold products. So for instance, if you're a retail company who produces garments, you also need packaging for them, which are produced by third-party manufacturers. So all the emissions associated when manufacturing of packaging falls under this category. So while the use of sold product is not directly part of the traditional supply chain, which is more focused on the movement and production of goods, it is still an integral part of the broader environmental impact of a product. So if you want to understand what that is, it's recommendable to include these emissions in your estimate as well. And I realize that it's often difficult to get your head around that there are also emissions from the use of the product. So if you, for instance, if you're producing a heater and the emissions that a customer causes by using it and buying electricity, this is also part of your Scope 3 emissions. So I think you get a sense why this Scope 3 poses the greatest challenge for those who try to measure it. It's not always intuitive what the limit is between different categories. And finally, there are a few categories for downstream assets, such as franchises and investments, which are mainly associated with financial institutions. So things you may not have direct control over. So having said that, another question you might be asking yourself is who is actually expecting of you to report on these emissions? What are the key drivers of emission disclosure? What do you think? You can put it in a chat box if you like. What is the first thing that comes to mind when you're thinking about key drivers? Who do you think might be requesting from you this information about climate disclosure? Okay. There are actually quite a few parties, I have to say, and we'll cover them briefly one by one. In fact, there are governments, companies, talent, customers are all among those who are currently looking out from you to disclose your emissions. And here they all are. So if we delve into each one of those a bit deeper, in terms of governmental regulation, it's really important to emphasize that expectations around climate disclosure have changed significantly. We've been seeing incredible progress in mandated climate disclosure globally. The regulations are coming every day, and they're coming in ever greater number. So for instance, if we took an example from the EU, where they have a new CSRD reporting directive, which is covering 50,000 companies, that's a huge expansion from the previous NFRD law. that mandates less robust disclosure and covers 11,000 companies. Novelty is that SMEs are affected now as well, because they're expected to disclose their emissions from 2026. So the companies covered by these rules are growing. They're not only relevant for the big companies, as it used to be, but are hitting smaller and smaller businesses. And for any company which has operations in the EU, if you're one of those, you must know that you're going to be subject to that law as well and required to disclose your Scope 3 emissions. And because your key customers need to report on their Scope 3 and require information from their suppliers, if that is you, you might end up being affected. So also you might have heard about carbon tax. In April 2023, EU has approved the world's first carbon border tax for some high carbon intensive imports, such as cement, steel, electricity, fertilizers, etc. And this will take effect at the beginning of the 2026. And when that happens, those who import their goods into the EU will have little less than 2 years to reduce their emissions or to pay a tax. So as you can see, the regulations are becoming more stringent, not only in the EU, but also in the UK, where more policies are being developed to help UK reach their net zero goals. And there are 3 which might affect you, so I'm just going to highlight them briefly here. The first of all is the Securities and Exchange Commission's rules which require public companies to disclose Scope 1 and 3 emissions. This signals regulatory shifts towards a more widespread climate-related reporting, and this might affect you if you have contracts with public sector companies. Secondly, we have the government's powering up written strategy, which includes a list of policies relative to energy efficiency of the new buildings. And this will mainly affect those operating in construction industry when it comes to into effect in 2025, as these individuals will need to adapt their supply chains to source materials that meet the energy efficiency criteria. And lastly, to help government on their journey to net zero, more and more policies will be developed at local council as well, expecting businesses to deliver stronger contribution to local carbon budgets. And local carbon budgets are allowable amounts of CO2 that can be emitted into atmosphere within a certain period of time. Your Southwark Council offers a lot of support for you on this journey, and we're going to speak about that in a bit more detail shortly. So also, we mentioned that even though SMEs are still not expected to disclose their emissions, they're coming under pressure through the corporations they supply, not only in the EU, this is happening also in the UK. So large companies need to report on their emissions in their supply chain, and they ask their suppliers to comply with the regulation. So it may happen that in order to access their supply chain, you might be asked to supply carbon reduction plan, which summarizes your current emissions and plans to reduce them, as well as your commitment to achieve net zero by 2050. There was a recent study by Standard Chartered, which was very insightful because what they've done, they surveyed the multinational companies, which can be your customers as well, and found that grand majority of them, around 78%, are actually planning by 2025 to reduce their reliance on those suppliers whose emissions contribute to their own carbon footprint significantly and impact their net zero goals. So that means that even though you might not have felt the need to set up science-based targets or may not have the need to reduce your emissions, these targets have already been set up for you by those big companies that you supply. And when they're starting to analyze their Scope 3 footprint and find out that your emissions are impacting on their numbers, you risk of being removed from their supplier list. So however, there's still a bit of time to adjust to their requirements, and many companies develop supplier programs to help suppliers reduce carbon emissions. So good idea is always to ask whether these big companies you supply have some supplier program, because it can also include funds. An example is Apple, for instance. It is a big company. You may not be servicing to Apple, but it's just an example of a company who has good supplier program, which has enabled them to run their renewable energy in all their operations they are now have become carbon neutral, and it's thanks to involvement with their suppliers who they've enabled to switch to renewable sources of energy. Your workforce also has high climate concern and needs looking from you to have them as well. You might already be familiar with this. We have, for instance, experienced during recruitment process, our HR team has been queried on our sustainability and net zero goals multiple times. So I find that very, very promising. According to one of the surveys published by Deloitte on millennials' expectation from workforce, by 2025, millennials will account for approximately 75% of overall global workforce, with generations then Z closely keeping up with them. And 39% of those millennials who have been surveyed has declared that they have already changed jobs due to climate concerns, or those who haven't changed, they're planning to do so in the future, which means that companies that don't address adequately their carbon emissions, they will find themselves struggling to attract top talent shortly, which may impact their competitiveness on the long run. And lastly, our customers are increasingly looking for companies that act on issues they're concerned about, some 55% based on the survey conducted by Deloitte. And they believe that business today have a greater responsibility to act on issues related to their purpose. So those failing to do so risk being displaced by purpose-driven businesses. And this graph here shows just that. So what we have here are the results of analysis of purposeful companies conducted by the Corporate Board and Ernst & Young, suggesting that purposeful companies outperform the stock market by 42%, while companies without a purpose within their vision, they underperform by 40%, which is a very compelling financial evidence and a proof that companies with a clear purpose actually do sell in the market. So one good example of this in practice is Unilever's purpose-driven businesses, which are witnessing 70% growth compared to non-purpose-driven part of the business. And Patagonia as well, another environmental leader in the field. They're very much famous about it for their transparency when it comes to sourcing processes. But this time around, they've gone so far to tell their customers not to buy their products, encouraging them to repair, reuse, recycle instead. So think about circular economy. So they've even launched an ad with Patagonia's highest grossing fleece jacket below the words, "Don't buy this jacket," as you can see here on the slide. And despite their effort to dissuade their customers from buying their products, their sales actually went up by 30%. So it's just another proof that going green definitely attracts new customers. And you could be thinking, well, that's all fine, but what are the real benefits of measuring emissions for me? What's in it for me? So basically, there's a spectrum of actions that you can take, from simply mitigating the risk to making it an opportunity for the business to serve wider sustainability objectives and achieve business growth. And I've categorized these benefits here into 4 main areas. So we'll break each one of these down. So if we start from the first benefit that you can achieve, which is more relative to mitigation of the risk and your ability to ensure business continuity. So there are 2 key risks to keep in mind. First one is a regulatory risk, and this is which we previously touched base on this. So in simple terms, if the company doesn't voluntarily reduce their carbon emissions, regulation will compel them to do so. And the longer they wait, the pricier it will get. So recent analysis conducted for Principles for Responsible Investment finds that policy change expected to come by 2025 will wipe out billions of pounds in value from world's largest companies. So you might be thinking that it won't affect you. It won't affect you immediately, or it won't affect you in the near future, but it's coming your way definitely in a couple of years from now. So additional risk you might have is the risk of having stranded goods due to climate change disruption. An industry that comes to mind that might be affected by this is construction, because they rely on raw materials sourced globally. And as a response, it's good to have resilience resourcing strategy and engage your suppliers from different locations to help mitigate this risk. Then the next step is about your ability to reduce costs through eco-efficiencies. Cost savings and revenue growth are interrelated. They both come from eco-efficiencies, and this is the area which is the easiest one to gain consensus on across the board. So ways to make your supply chain more efficient is very much related to your selection of suppliers. You would select those who use recyclable materials, who use alternative sources of transport, reduce energy use and waste. And studies show that making small efficiencies can lower the supply chain costs up to 16% and uplift revenue by 20%, if not more. So small changes end up adding up on a whole. So this improved resource efficiency then have positive effect on overall profitability, but also on stock price and market share. The last one is the most exciting. It's about your ability to grow business and gain competitive edge by differentiating your brand and responding to customers' need for environmental friendly goods and services. So it's been documented in one of the recent Simon Kucher reports that customers are actually willing to spend more on the net zero products and services. They found that they're willing to spend up to 33% more. And this applies to businesses as well. And I saw that earlier template that our procurement policies are very much changing towards including and spending more on the net zero products. So just think about your actions. Did it ever happen to you to choose a train over a plane because it's simply greener options, if it means adding 5 hours to your travel time? Or did you ever buy a shirt from charity shop instead of a designer version that you desire because it helps with circular economy? Do you drive electric instead of a diesel car? So in all those cases, you're actually making a personal choice that you believe can add up and contribute on a global level. So this is what your customers do as well. Just think about it. And finally, innovation is something that also helps you grow your business. For example, if it becomes more costly in monetary and carbon terms to transport your goods over long distances, the local sources will become more prominent. And just think about all those SMEs that have made their brand thanks to local sourcing. So think about farm to table, craft breweries, handmade artisan goods. You have the advantage over big companies when it comes to leveraging not only local sourcing, but also renewable energy sources to meet your energy needs. So this is not an option for big companies because their global presence, scale of their operations. So that's where your possibility to differentiate yourself and stand out from them stands. Okay, that pretty much covers this part. So at this point, we can pause for another Menti. And bear with me till I switch to Menti. One moment. And this time around, I would like to ask you, what do you think are the biggest obstacles to measuring and managing carbon emissions in your company? So this is a multiple choice questions. So feel free to choose more than one. Again, you have the code on the slide. So I'm just going to wait for a couple of seconds till you add your answers. Okay. Lovely. Lack of guidance, surprisingly. Yeah, so I'll just give you 5 more seconds. Lovely. Okay, so the winner is definitely lack of guidance or knowledge on how to proceed, which I'm happy that that is not something more limiting. As we here, we're going to provide you with the all need information that can be useful for you to start your journey. Limited time availability comes down to next, and I can understand that because SMEs often don't have dedicated sustainability teams, so it's difficult to find time when you are dedicated to other tasks in the company. Concerns about a high initial investment cost, I have to say that this one traditionally comes first. So I'm a bit surprised that it's so down on this list. But we will talk about that in more detail briefly. Okay. Okay, so now that we've seen what the main barriers are to net zero action in your companies, we're going to have a look what these barriers are generally in SMEs in the UK. Going back to our presentation. Okay. So according to the latest survey conducted by British Business Bank, that they've surveyed SMEs who didn't assess their climate impact, asking them the reasons why is that so. And the primary obstacle reported was the cost of investment. The second most common challenge was a lack of house understanding of expertise, as this our poll just showed. And the third barrier was feasibility, so lack of time, tools to measure, monitor emissions. So SMEs often, as we said, that is frequently the problem. But there are many resources online that you can use, such as, for instance, the SME Climate Hub. They offer a lot of support for you, and I will provide in the end of the session the links to the most useful website that you can look at. But even when cost is not an issue, when lack of knowledge is not an issue, there are other challenges which are holding them back. So one of these challenges is that supply chain emissions, frankly, are really difficult to measure because of all those steps you have in the supply chain. And the larger the supply chain, the more decentralized it gets. So ideally, we want to be obtaining this emission data from our suppliers, but doing so and engaging our suppliers, it takes time. This can be a very slow process. Sometimes it can last for years for big companies, but if they haven't performed G&G inventory or life cycle analysis of their products, then we need to be successful enough to be able to pressure them to do so, and that also takes time. So, and the more data you get, the more unwieldy this whole process becomes. And even when we manage to obtain data from suppliers, these are often incomplete or inaccurate. So, it's definitely hard to tackle this challenge. But I wasn't planning to discourage you here to tackle the emissions. I just wanted to point out that this is a challenge for SMEs, and they are all aware of that. But there are many resources out there which you can use to support you along the way. Keep in mind that new funding opportunities are frequently announced, so it's useful to keep track of them. I provided a link here where you can check the national opportunities that are becoming available. As well as local opportunities. It's important to be aware that there are a lot of grants locally that are only available for a year or so. So keep up to date by checking with your council to make yourself aware of what's out there. I've mentioned previously that Southern Council offers support. This support for instance, for those who are willing to switch their delivery using electric cargo bikes. The support includes funding as well, but there's a lot of additional support available for you. So just check with them these opportunities as they come. Okay, so we're going to need some guidance if we're starting this journey, right? So what do we have here? There are a number of standards that we use to estimate greenhouse gas emissions. The most important one is Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which has a standard for corporate reporting, and they've got specific subset of publication on reporting scope 3, which we need to look at. And then they got a guidance focused on product life cycle accounting. So if your intention is to report on carbon footprint of your product, it's good to keep that in mind. For instance, for consumer goods producers, it provides good methods to assess emissions across upstream and downstream value chains. Some sectors have gone a bit further and have provided guidance which is very specific and quite robust, and such as the example of the guidance to assess emissions from beverage industry. And just so you know, when you start looking at standards, there are two key areas. One is reporting framework, that's your G&G protocol, and one is evaluation framework. So the reporting frameworks guide you how and what to report, and the evaluation framework, like CDP, for instance, they assess how well you're performing. They provide you with the rating and ranking of that performance so that you can compare yourself with others in the industry. So I have prepared here a couple of case studies, and I will very quickly run through this. I just had to select a few. The one I wanted to highlight is the case of Bellu, a mineral water producer company, which realized that their carbon footprint of their product is quite significant, specifically of glass bottles they used. So they improved their production process, developing lightweight glass bottles that were fully recyclable. And that, if that wasn't enough for them, they wanted more, so they invested their profits to replace bottled water in Hong Kong with reusable UK lightweight bottles they produced. And by doing so, they've not only tackled UK's waste issue, but they created lightweight glass bottles that helped reduce plastic waste in Hong Kong. So basically, they shifted from linear economy to circular economy, where the waste was avoided by reusing and recycling products. So this approach has earned them the accolade of the Green Company of the Year. So briefly, the purpose of that example is just to showcase that sustainability is business nowadays, and business is sustainability. They are inherently linked. And when sustainability becomes part of the process, it brings many benefits for the business, which goes beyond just environmental improvement. So we're talking about reputation, competitive edge, and so on. And very quickly here, I'm just going to run through remaining case studies. I won't go into too much details. I just would like to say that there are a couple of small companies that I presented here, such as Organic Growth. That's a food production company. In the industry, which is highly under scrutiny for their level of carbon emissions, they started performing small eco-efficiency by engaging transport partners and running customer awareness campaigns to help save them cost. And they haven't realized that this is going to have a significant environmental advantage, but also that it will appeal to their customers, which increase their sales and profits and help them differentiate themselves early on as a sustainable supplier. Then we have Climate Action Tech, which has become a symbol for transparency of climate disclosure, because they managed to screen 15 categories of their scope 3 emissions. That is quite remarkable, covering 75% of their emissions. And finally, we have Ethical Fashions, which is Ethical Fashions, that's a clothing brand, which engage their suppliers at each single stage of the supply chain process, achieving 12% of carbon reduction that way. So one of the reasons I wanted to highlight these very simple examples is because we previously mentioned that the issue is the high cost of investment. And I see that there will be large investments, but there are still many more improvements that you can make so that to your business processes, and that can definitely go a long way. And we've mentioned them earlier, but I'm going to delve deeper into it very shortly. So let's move on to see what you can do in specific. And now, for those of you who are already on a journey to net zero, this is probably familiar, but I'm just going to mention that this simple 6-step methodology can be adopted to achieve your net zero goal. This has been created by Route to Net Zero Standard, published by Carbon Trust. And this slide sets out what would be example of overarching framework for how climate declarations may be taken forward. We won't be covering all those steps in this session. I'm just going to mention the first 3, and the other 3 will be discussed in the following webinar. So the first phase will include initial scoping. So that's what you're trying to achieve. Are you talking about one part of the organization? Are you talking about the entire organization with regional offices? This is what will be included in this section. Moving on, you'll be expected to calculate your footprint and set up a baseline. So this is about understanding of your emissions and how they're likely to change with time. Once you know that, you'll be able to define a suitable target. If this is something you would like to do, this is not mandatory step for SMEs, but some SMEs like to go a step further. So worth mentioning. Next step is development of action plans. So it's about identification of the actions you may need to take to reduce your emissions, such as engaging your suppliers, optimizing your logistics, and so on. And finally, the last stage is monitoring evaluation. So this is tracking progress against target, ensuring that a suitable framework for management is in place. So another Menti for you I've got here before we move on to calculation of your greenhouse gas emissions. And this will be the last Menti I have. Let me just jump into it. Here it is. Just bear with me till I switch the presentation. There you go. I'm curious to know at which level you currently stand. You might be already an expert who have completed a calculation of your Scope 3 emissions, so you might only be at the start of this journey. Lovely. You just keep them coming. I'm just going to wait for a couple of seconds. All right. Okay, so we have the majority of answers under beginner section. So you are quite new to all this, as I would expect, and you will need a detailed guidance. There are those of you who are advanced, so I'm going to, you might be interested more in the second part of this measurement. So it's best if we jump on it right away. Okay, going back to our presentation. Here we go. Okay, so just before we start calculating our emissions, we need to understand what is exactly that we're measuring. The supply chain, by their definition, is a series of activities that an organization engages in to create and deliver a product or service to its customers. But to measure these emissions, you need to include all different elements of the product service life cycle. So you start with sourcing of raw materials. You might process them as well. For instance, if you have a food production company, this is what your business is. You then distribute your products. These products are used and then they are disposed of in the end of life and returned into the supply chain for reuse or recycling. And that's what this image represents. It's sort of a cycle that you need to follow. In practice, estimating these emissions is achieved by summarizing your upstream and downstream carbon emissions. And within these emissions are including many different greenhouse gas emissions. It's not just carbon, but we translate them in tons of CO2 equivalent for easier comparison. Or it may not be tons, it may be kilograms, for instance. And that's what companies need to try and measure, that kind of overall carbon impact of the products and services they provide. So now that we know what we need to measure, I will provide you with a step-by-step guidance on calculating these emissions, finally. This begins with a very simple process. As mentioned previously, there is a very good source of information to which you will continuously be referring to along the process, and that is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So Greenhouse Gas Protocol is a non-profit organization. They publish multiple helpful pieces of information. If you have any doubts on how to proceed, you will find all the information you need in that guidance. So the first step consists in defining your emission boundaries. So it's basically about defining what's material to you. We'll speak about that a bit more later. I just wanted to give you a quick overview of these steps. A next step would involve collecting activity data for each different Scope 3 category. Then you would calculate greenhouse gas emissions for these categories. And finally, you would analyze your footprint to understand where the hotspots lie and disclose it through reporting. Okay, so to understand what we need to measure, first thing we need to do is just draw an operational boundary. So will this be your main office? Will this be your regional offices? Could be a factory, could be, you could be in joint venture with other companies. So you need to understand which one you will include and in your boundary. And to do that, you can use one of the three methods. Equity share, which is based on your ownership of that business. So for instance, if you own 30% of joint venture, you will include that. Operational control, which is based on your control of the business, part of the business that you control, you include. And financial control is about the financial control of the business that you have. So you will, if you have the financial control over 50% of the business, you include only that part. So next step would be to list down all the upstream and downstream Scope 3 emission categories within your boundary, and these will be different depending on the sector one operates in. You might end up having 15 of these, but you won't be able to address all of them. So you will need to learn how to prioritize those that contribute the most to your emissions. It will in the end be probably around 5 to 10 categories maximum. So just have a look at a Scope 3 standard that will provide you with criteria to identify relevant Scope 3 activities based on spend, operational control, stakeholder concerns. You can choose the parameter which is the most suitable for your needs. So the example exercise that we've done here in terms of impact of carbon emissions against spend for companies from different industries, it was created just to show you where the emissions for different companies come from. In this case, we have IT company, which is a service company, and a construction company. And they will have very different categories. So basically, when you're starting, if you just look at your cost structure, you will immediately see where the emissions come from. While business travel and employee commuting are the two highest cost items for most of the service companies, this is where your emissions come from if these are the highest items in their cost structure. So for instance, at Temple, we don't purchase a lot of goods. We purchase paper, which purchase stationery. So our cost items are mainly stem from employee commuting or business travel, and this holds true for majority of service companies. If you're a construction company, it's a completely different picture because you purchase a lot of materials. So you will purchase steel, cement, aluminium for your construction. At the same time, you will have a lot of capital goods that you purchase because of all the equipment, machinery you need to purchase to work on site. You might also have to look into the waste generated during operations. And the one challenging one is the use of sole product. So for instance, if you are a developer property developer who is developing energy efficient buildings, you need to decide whether you want to include PV, solar heating. So you need to be thinking about the impact that usage of that building has on carbon emissions on the long run. So even this one is a tricky one to get your head around. It actually provides you with the opportunity to make a long-term carbon reduction and impact. And you might also have emissions associated with end-of-life treatment. So this is just a very practical approach to start addressing your Scope 3 emissions. If you are not keen on analyzing every single source of emissions, just start from looking at your cost structure. You will immediately see where your emissions come from. This is the easiest one to use. So once we know the boundaries of the scope and the emission categories, we need to start collecting activity data to understand how to calculate emissions. For those of you who don't know, activity data are data on the level of an activity that affects greenhouse gas emissions. And determining which approach to use depends basically on the time you have, resources you have, your familiarity with Scope 3 reporting, and most importantly, what data is available to you. If activity data is available, for example, kilowatts of electricity consumed, liters of fuel, like in the case of this online retailer that I've presented on this slide, then you can use those. So consider surveying key suppliers to request activity data or emissions totals. And if that proves difficult to obtain, as it often is, we can start looking at the spend data. So in this case, it's a total spent on train tickets for business travel. And with the spent data, what you do, you're actually filling the gaps that you have from missing activity data. And for majority of organization, a mix of these approaches will probably be used entirely dependent of what data is available. But over time, as you get more information, your estimates will improve. Okay, so now you have collected all the activity data and want to calculate your scope 3 emissions. To do that, you need to know the emission factor for the source of the emissions that you're analyzing. And for those of you who are not familiar with what emission factor is, that's the mass of carbon dioxide that's emitted per unit of the activity. So as an example, this could be tons of CO2 per liter of fuel consumed, or it could be kilograms of CO2 that's produced per product that's created. And there are two approaches that we use to find this factor. For activity data, we use specific emission factors published by publicly available conversion factor databases like governmental BI's database. These emission factors are applied to different life cycle phases of a product activity life. So this result is a highly accurate emission factor. It's specific to that activity, to that product. And if we look on the other hand at a spend-based method, this creates emission factors in terms of how much money is spent on that product or activity within a specific industry or sector. And generally these factors, they are quicker to apply, but they are not as accurate as activity data factors. And you will find them available from DEFRA's EIO database. The primary difference between measuring scope 1 and 3 emissions is that scope 3 needs to be evolved and refined over time. So for those who are new to carbon accounting, the spend-based method, which uses sector-specific emission factor, will be good enough to start with. It is a definitely easier one to use because purchasing records are generally more readily available in most of the companies. So that's the least accurate method, it's correct, but if you just want to have a general understanding of the scale of your footprint, and then it might be sufficient for you. However, in time, as you gain more experience, because you'll be doing this exercise on an annual basis, it was recommended to transition to increasingly more accurate method. And this means moving towards using company-specific and eventually service product-specific emission factors, which often requires closer engagement with your suppliers. So to put this approach into practice, we estimated downstream transport emissions from third-party logistic vehicles. That's that downstream transportation, if you remember. And this is the volume calculation from spend-based to supplier-based approach. Initially, we didn't have any data available in terms of activities, so we just used spend data on the service, and we use carbon intensity of the sector as a whole, which meant that we weren't taking into account where we were buying from and what we were buying. Then when we got more accurate data from our suppliers in the following years, they provided us with data relative to the liters of fuel consumed, as well as the company level emission factor. Because some companies, they do create their emission factors if they understand their own footprinting. So you might get one of those from them. And that brought more accuracy to our results. And in time, we moved on to obtain more accurate emission factors, again, from our suppliers. And these were relative to specific goods. And now we had a clear picture on the environmental impact of our product. Things like environmental product declaration can provide this information. And that meant for us that we were, in the end, fully accounting for our procurement decisions. So this kind of estimate will need to be complete for each single emission category. So again, most of organizations end up using a mixture of these approaches. And when we put it all together, here's an example of a typical Scope 3 footprint breakdown for SME company. And it's fairly clear to see that purchase goods and services, capital goods, upstream and downstream transportation, they form a vast majority of Scope 3 emissions. So these categories together account for 90% of total Scope 3. And in this example, also see Scope 3 emissions for a majority of the emissions. It's very common to see that in SMEs, but not only in SMEs, also in the bigger companies. And we can see that contribution that we have for supply chain is quite significant. At this point, when we know we have our resulting data, we have all those numbers, but we don't clearly understand what all these tons of CO2, kilograms of CO2 means. And to help us understand that and present that to other people, we tend to put it in carbon intensity to make this data comparable. For example, if you're a construction company, you would like to know, if you are dealing with steel, you would not like to know the carbon intensity per ton of product so that you can compare it to carbon intensity of other materials and see which one has lower carbon content so that you can use it in the construction. Service companies, for instance, they might estimate carbon emissions per hour of service. So you will need to find the parameter that works best for you and make the comparison that way. Of course, once you've analyzed this, you can also review what the major sources of emissions are within those categories that you analyze, because only if you know where the emissions come from, you can identify actions to reduce them. Obviously, here on the list are also quite hot actions that require quite significant investment. And I understand that what we're talking about, equipment retrofit, product redesign, energy efficiency improvement, it's something that you may not get consensus from your management always, but there are a lot of small process improvements that you can implement right away. You can opt for instance, for local suppliers to minimize transportation-related emissions. You can implement behavioral changes within your organization, encourage sustainable commuting habits, such as use of public transportation. You can consider using electric modes of transport for local deliveries, recycle waste, etc. So many actions that can be implemented today if you wanted to. So when you've managed to reduce your emissions, you might consider also offsetting the remaining ones by supporting projects such as reforestation or renewable energy initiative to balance out your carbon footprint. This is obviously the last resource. This is not something that needs to be encouraged, but obviously if you have the remaining emissions, you might consider to offset them as well. And if you want to go a step further and you want to publicly disclose your emissions, you may consider also setting yourself a target. Again, this is not required from you to do. SBTi prescribes a target that is in line with a 1.5 pathway. If you decide to set it, it needs to cover 2/3 of a total Scope 3 emissions if your Scope 3 accounts for 40% of the total footprint. In case of SMEs, only long-term targets should be set because due to complexity of their supply chain and difficulty of reaching net zero emissions. But it's always a good idea to check out what other companies are doing in this context. Oops. Just a moment. I'm having issues of switching to the next slide. Just a moment. Oops. You see? Oh, I can't. Apologize. Oh, here it is. Perfect. A little technical glitch. Apologize for that. So I would recommend you having a look at the SBTi's website. That's a fantastic source of information if you want to set up a target. They offer a lot of sector-specific guidance. you won't find here guidances for each sector, but for instance, you will find it for retail, for IT industry. You won't find it for construction, for instance. But in that case, what I would recommend you to do is to check out on the same website. They have a dashboard with the list of all the companies that have set up targets. If you look at the ones from your sector, it will give you a clear understanding what is expected of you and how you need to set up this target. It will give you a lot of information. You will be able to see how other people have done it before you. Okay, so before I show you the resultant analysis of our carbon footprint, I'd like to share the example of some sector-specific Scope 3 emissions. So these are the sources of Scope 3 emissions for different sectors. There was a report issued by Science Based Targets initiative. I've just used some outputs from that report to show where typical sources are for different industries. So the first one is related to food and beverage industry and retailers. It's things that make part of fast-moving consumer goods. And what you can see here, they all have a similar trait in the fact that vast majority of their emissions sit in the purchased goods in services. So that's the embodied emissions typically of what they're making. Other notable sources are in distribution and in transportation. Then we have construction. As you can see here, the big dominant area is the use of products, and there's a real swing from the fast-moving goods. There's a still significant representation from the purchased goods and services, capital goods, as well as distribution and inbound transportation. But there is a bit of change when it comes to fast-moving goods. The last one is professional services, and the graph becomes a lot more multicolored, and the employing commuting starts having material impact. Other categories, there's one section called other categories, that's the gray one here on this pie chart. That's represented by third-party data hosting. Preferably, that should make part of the purchase goods and services, but in this case, I think it was just material enough to be represented separately. So complexly, we can say that for SMEs, the most significant Scope 2 emissions come from purchase goods and services, capital goods, distribution, and transportation in general. This is the resultant footprint from, I've shown you in the previous slide, I've shown you the results in terms of the numerical information for the SME carbon footprint, but this time around, I've analyzed it, I've created a pie chart, and I was wondering if you knew to which sector this belongs to. If you look at it, majority emissions are in purchase goods and services, capital goods, downstream transport and distribution, upstream transport. These are the main sources of emission. If you like, you can put down an answer in the chat box. I think it's fairly easy and self-explanatory that this needs to come from a sector which produces a lot of products. In fact, this comes from food and food industry. This is typical of one food production company. Okay, that's good. Now that we have analyzed our footprint, one thing we need to do is to disclose it to the outside world, if we want to, obviously. If we want to, we would then present it nicely. We would break it down in different categories. If you are, for instance, from industry which produces a lot of products, such as food and beverage industry, you can break it by different products as well to make it more clear. But if this is not your desire, if you simply want to use it for your internal purposes, then you can put down all the data in Excel format. We, for instance, at Temple, we have it in the Excel spreadsheet, and then we use it to discuss it between the team and to see which categories of emissions we need to focus on. So once you put all your results in the report, it's good to have it certified by third party. It has a lot of benefits. It can help with engaging customers, stakeholders, enhancing your reputation. If you decide to set up science-based targets, actually this would form part of your commitment to publicly disclose emissions, so you can use it for that as well. Or if you have corporate social responsibility program in your company, it would be good for this report to make part of that, because it had helped attract investors, and it's just it strains their perceptions about a corporate governance of business. And finally, it definitely provides advantage in tenders, because it makes the company an attractive choice for partners and clients who prioritize sustainability. So now that we've disclosed our emissions, we've done what we were planning to do. I would just like to say a few words about a future of carbon measurement, monitoring, and disclosure in general. So I'm sure that you would have noticed the advent of artificial intelligence being ever more present in our lives, and eventually the supply chain management will need to follow suit and become more automated. So we're still, fortunately, not at this point, as the pickup is not particularly fast, but it's worth mentioning where we're heading. So I've listed here the emerging technologies in this field that can help you manage better the Scope 3 emissions. Those more promising to SME context would be 3, and I've highlighted them there. And I'm just going to provide you with an example how this can be used to your advantage. So if, for instance, you place IoT sensors throughout your supply chain, from manufacturing plants to transportation vehicles, these sensors can then monitor energy usage, fuel consumption, and other relevant parameters that contribute to emissions. And once you've collected those data, the blockchain technology will keep records from all your sensors in unique location. So sort of like a ledger, and it will provide you the carbon impact of your supply chain. So you don't need to do a little Excel exercise. So at that point, advanced analytics will use smart tools to study complicated data. It will have fine patterns and make better decisions, like predicting what customer might like or managing risk, and will also identify opportunities for reduction of your carbon footprint. So they will do everything in your place. You won't have to think about carbon footprinting anymore. But having said that, obviously the affordability is still an issue of on incorporation of these technologies. But we see as the choice of providers increases, the cost of solutions reduces day by day. So that creates more opportunity to invest in these solutions in the future. Okay. So now I've prepared a little exercise, and I would really like for you to take part in it. It consists in selecting emission sources within Scope 3 associated with a retail company activities. And for this purpose, I prepared a form for you to complete. I will provide that in a chat box in a second. Keep in mind, this is a multiple choice question, so please pick more than one answer. I will just give you a bit of time to think about it. And here it goes. One moment, bear with me. This. I will add it here in the chat box for you. All you need to do, simply put, is to select Scope 3 emission sources from this list. I will just give you a bit of time so that you can think about it. Think about, I might give you a bit of a hand. So think about the things that you burn at your premises. This will always be your Scope 1. If you're buying something, if you're purchasing energy, it will be your Scope 2. All the other emissions, upstream and downstream, that will come from your Scope 3. You can see that answers are coming in. I'm going to give you a bit more time. It may not be so straightforward to understand sometimes the limit between each scope. Okay. You keep them coming. I'll wait a couple of more minutes. So this is a retail company. They have their franchises, they have their licenses. Yeah, they produce their own products. Okay. Okay, I'm going to give you 1 more minute. I think that, yeah, I think that everyone might have responded. Okay, I'll check your responses now to see where we stand. And I'm curious to see that. Okay. So, oops. All right. Actually, I'll share with you the responses so that you can double check if you've responded correctly. So the first one was emissions from extracting and processing of raw materials for the product sold. This comes immediately, you can see this comes from the purchase goods and services category, and it's definitely a scope 3. Emissions from employees traveling to and from retail locations, employee commuting, if you recall, category, another scope 3 category. Then we have emissions from disposal of products, including both retail operations waste and product end-of-life waste. That's the end-of-life category, another scope 3 category. And the next one is tricky. And I've seen previously that some people assume that this would be scope 3. But it is not. If the retail company relies on district heating or cooling system, you can easily make a mistake here of assuming that this is scope 1 because heating, usually people associated it with scope 1, but here we are purchasing heating, which is being transmitted to our premises. So we are buying that energy. That's why it falls under scope 2. Emissions from travel associated with the business meeting, that's typically business travel, so scope 3 definitely. Emissions from fuel combustion in vehicles operated by the retail company. These are the vehicles that are operated by the company, and that's why scope 1. If they weren't owned by the company, if they were the third-party vehicles, then this would be our scope 3. So that's the distinction between the two. Emissions from the activities of franchises, because a retail company can also have their franchises, and in that case, we also have to account their emissions reluctantly because we don't always want to. And emissions from the combustion of fuels in company on-site generators. So if you're burning anything at your premises, remember that is always scope 1. Okay, good job. Now I have another activity for you, and this will be a quick one as well. You'll need to assess how much of each emission category forming part of coffee roaster scope 3 contributes to the company's overall carbon footprint. I'll place this in the chat box, place this link in a second. Here you go. Just bear with me. And in this case, I invite you to think about what kind of company we're talking about here. As you recall, it's a coffee roaster, but it's a food company. So think about where the emissions lie for a food company and how much of that contribution we might expect for someone who is a coffee roaster. So they're purchasing their goods from maybe some African or South American country. That is where the production process occurs. So that might involve a lot of the transport. Yeah, I will give you a couple of minutes. Mhm. And I've here separated packaging from purchased item because packages is quite a significant contributor. It itself. It's if you see it separated like that, note that it's very material. It deserves to be separated because it contributes a lot. Okay. Give you a couple of more minutes. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's check out your responses. Check them here just to understand how you replied. Very well. I'm very pleased to see that you recognized that the purchase item is the most contributing, as well as deliveries. Well, they all are, but it's predominantly it's in purchasing that we need to focus on. And here are the results. So 34% comes from green coffee and other purchase items. And I've listed it here. I've separated green coffee from other purchase items because the majority of these emissions comes from sourcing of green coffee. It's a very, very energy intensive process, and that's why it takes up the majority of our carbon footprint. Packaging, 11%, that's quite a lot, but the deliveries mainly because this coffee needs to be transported over long distances to come to our premises. So transportation is the biggest, together with the purchase item, the biggest contributor here. Okay, lovely. Fantastic. So before we conclude, I would just like to provide you with a few useful links if you're trying to calculate your emissions. And the first one I'm including right here, your go-to providers of the carbon intensity factors, and I mentioned them earlier. So these are the spreadsheets of factors that you can use, produced by government. Then you have SME Climate Hub, carbon footprint, a very useful one. This website in general, it's a very useful source of information for anyone starting with carbon footprinting. It provides various resources for SMEs. You have Carbon Trust Free Calculator. You also have Greenhouse Gas Protocols. They have their own Scope 3 calculator. And if you would like to disclose your emissions, you can do that through CPD or Race to Zero. And finally, the Science Based Target Initiative is a go-to place for all those who want to go a step further than a mere disclosure of emissions and set up the science-based targets. Okay, so thank you all for listening. That brings us to our final Q&A session. I think we're just about hitting the end. If you'd like to ask any question, please feel free to do so.
Maya, there are a couple of questions in the chat box.
Yeah.
Already.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you had a chance to check.
Yeah, I will check in a second. Most employees, this is the question from Marisa. Why is the employee commuting covered in the Scope 3 if the employees pay for their own commuting? Yeah, so in this case, it's because the employees also make part of that company. So when we want to think about the overarching impact of the company emissions, we need to include their emissions as well. This is also when it comes to, for instance, to they're working from home. This is also included within the Scope 3 because the emissions that your employees produce when working from home need to be accounted for, as we consider that they also make part of the company's operations. It's simply an overarching approach to make sure that we haven't missed anything. This is the case also. You will see that there's
Hi,
a lot of.
Hey, lovely.
Sorry?
How are you?
Yes, yeah, good. You okay?
You will see that there is a lot of overlap sometimes between different categories. And I get asked often, isn't there a risk that the Scope 3 emissions can overlap with someone else's Scope 1 and 2 emissions? And this is often the case. But the goal that we have in mind here is not simply to obtain the perfectly accurate figure for the emissions. It's to understand the overarching impact of environmental products so that we know how to improve our processes, how to reduce emissions, because if we're discounting emissions as someone else's, then we risk of underestimating them as well. And even more so, think about it that even if there is any overlap with different categories, you by counting more emission sources, you're just simply helping UK reach faster net zero goals. So it's actually beneficial for you. I know it can sometimes seem like a daunting task to take into account so many categories, but it's just because we need to. It's like with use of the sole product. We're thinking about how the products that we use are being used by our customers and what kind of emissions are they producing. Just to be sure that we are including all emissions in our estimations. Another question, if we purchase goods on behalf of clients, not for ourselves, does the carbon emission associated with the product sit with them? Do we just need to calculate the emissions generated in providing them the service or of buying the goods? Can you clarify when you say that you purchase good on behalf of clients?
Maybe I can help with
Yes,
this one.
yeah. Can you?
Yeah, I probably will just adding on a couple of points for the first question. Is that so the commuting emissions is still if the company consider mitigation, the commuting, despite commuting expenses is covered by the individual. However, the individual's activity, the environmental impact is actually beyond that expenses. So a company would more likely to tackle the emission as an overall because of several reasons. For example, they may consider the sustainability goal by reducing emissions with their operation, which would including employee commuting, and also for consider employee well-being, because if they understand how employee commuting to work, there may be opportunity for them to promoting, for example, public transport, more eco-friendly commuting, and allow flexible working as well. So that's part of the reason behind it as well. And also have regulatory compliance in terms of report and reduce emission, and also providing opportunities for improvement. The second question is not, it's a very good question because some of the things is really depending on the context. So when a company purchases goods on behalf of the client, the carbon emission associated with that goods potentially could be allocated in different ways depending on the purpose, the context, and the agreement between the parties involved, between your company and the client, for example. There may be some different scenarios One could be passing through emissions. You simply did it on behalf of your client. So that emission associated the production, transportation, and disposal of that goods maybe would be considered a responsibility of a client because you simply acted on behalf of your client. That's potentially one scenario. Another scenario might be it's a shared responsibility because the company and the client may agree to share that emission associated with purchased goods, potentially involve like negotiate the contract regarding emission responsibilities and allocation based on the goods purchased by each party. And another potential scenario is consider when you consider offsetting emissions. Some company would choose to offset the carbon emissions associated with goods purchase on behalf of the client as part of their sustainability efforts because that's part of their activities. So they may consider investment in carbon offsetting or purchasing, for example, carbon credits, so to compensate that emission generated. So there is not a complete black-white. It's really probably depends on the agreement context, how that can be allocated. So I hope that gives some ideas.
Mm-hmm. Let me see if we have any other question here. Oh yeah, this is a similar one. If we purchase goods on behalf of clients, not for ourselves, does the carbon emissions associated with them products sit with them? And Sean has covered this question. Do we just need to calculate the emission generated providing them the service? Yeah. This is about buying advertising, if that helps, so we know there is a carbon emission associated with the final. And yeah, I think that this has been covered in the previous answer. Who defines what's included in our scope 3 emissions for this scheme? Can I clarify, do we calculate the emissions ourselves? And do we have support in doing so? Yes, it is you who decide what you want to include in your scope 3, unless you decide that you want to set up a science-based target, and at that point you need to include two-thirds of your emissions. But you decide that based on the different criteria which you can find in your greenhouse gas protocol. So that can be done by spend, by operational control, stakeholder concern, etc. You decide which method you want to use. And as I've shown previously, if you decide you want to include only those items that are that present the highest spend for your company, because that's directly correlated with the carbon intensity of products. The spend, the more expensive the products are, the more carbon intensive they tend to be. There are more emissions coming from them. So you might focus on those. You generally focus on the items that produce most emissions. So you will choose a couple of categories. You won't have to cover all 15, and you won't have probably 15 categories that are relevant to your case. So this is completely up to you, but obviously choosing the categories that produce more carbon emissions is better, because you will be able to cut down and fast your emissions. Do we have support in doing so? Yes, I have provided various resources in the last slide that you can have a look at. These are, if you want to use the carbon calculators, they do all the calculations for you. And they are often very simple and based on the spend-based approach. So they won't be highly accurate. It would be more accurate if you did the estimate yourself, but for a start, you can use those calculators. You can use guidances such as greenhouse gas protocol for scope 3, and that can be a starting point. I believe that all the information you will find in there. And again, SME Climate Hub, very good source of information for SMEs. You will find there a lot of help and support on this journey. Remember, for funding, check out always your local council. In this case, is Southwark So check out what kind of support they have for you. Would it be possible to share the slides? Yeah, the slides will be shared following the session. Mim, I believe that they will be on the Climate Collective webpage, right?
Yes, there's a section in the website under resources where you will be able to find some of the materials from various training sessions, but I will also follow up with an email to all those who were registered for today.
Mm-hmm. I can't see any more questions. In case you have more questions, feel free to ask now.
I will just add on in terms of Scope 3 emissions and where you maybe get support. If you have a question where you're starting to do your Scope 3 emissions or wanting to put your emission inventory together, we are very happy to answer your questions. Just drop us an email. I think Maya can share our contact email. Yeah, just feel free to reach out. We can certainly be happy to providing assistance on that.
Yeah. And with that, I'm just going to show you the last slide. We've put down here our contact details for Sean and me. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. We're always happy to help out. You have here our email addresses and the phone number of the company. So we expect to hear from you. And I think this brings us to the end of this session. I will hand it over to Mim at this point.
Thank you, Maya. Big thank you to Maya and of course Shan as well for hosting today's brilliant session. And thank you to everyone still on the line for the time and for your participation. Some really good questions as well. So I won't keep you. I'll let you all go, but we hope to see you at one of our next events. As I said, an email will be coming your way with today's materials. Catch you all soon.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Bye.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.